Welcome to the Pazik Performance Group podcast. I am Tyler Pazik, and today we have Gina Karnisovas on the Pod. So Gina has a master's degree in human development with a specialization in sports psychology from Boston University. She has also earned a master's degree in mental health and counseling and completed an additional certificate program in sports psychology at Seton Hall University. So her experience with sports psychology has helped her navigate life as much as it's guided her in helping others. So for nearly 20 years, she's been intimately involved in the world of sports, both personally and professionally. This woman is amazing. She holds 2 black belts, one in mixed martial arts and another in Tae Kwon Do. She's been an avid runner and competed in occasional mixed distance events. So she's worked in the field of neurofeedback as well for the last 4.5 years, and strongly believes in the efficacy of training the brain to self-regulate. And you guys know I'm a big believer of self-regulation and self-reliance. So I am incredibly excited to get into the podcast with her. She's worked for more than 13 years in counseling and coaching individuals of all ages, groups, families, and performers, and is adept in tailoring action plans to the unique needs of the client. So without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome to the Pod. Gina, I'm super excited to have you on today.
I'm really excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me. This is great.
Yeah, I'm just excited. So I'm going to jump right in. Basically, what is one of the strategies that you have found yourself using often lately, like with your clients?
Yeah, so on the individual clients that I use, that I work with, um, one of the things that I've found most helpful that I seem to be using most often right now is some really basic kind of mindfulness and diaphragmatic breathing. To your point, I think the idea of self-regulation is one of the most critical things that we can teach our clients, right? Whether that is in a individual setting or in a team setting or in a corporate setting. And that starts with self-awareness. And so one of the things that I always kind of tell my clients is that without awareness, there's no change. So you can talk about wanting to be different. You can talk about doing things differently all day long. But unless you have some level of awareness, that's not going to happen, right? So one of the things that I've found myself working with a lot is basic diaphragmatic breathing, number one. Some mindfulness in terms of like recognizing where your body is in space, feeling the chair, against your back, your feet on the floor, those kind of things. And then one of the things that I've found most helpful for folks lately, and I don't know if it's just kind of the time we're in right now, which is a little bit unnerving for a lot of people, but I found using sort of this 3-to-1 ratio, which is not anything that I've come up with, but it's 3 things that you've done well on that particular day and 1 thing that you learned that day. And I found that to be really kind of helpful for folks in terms of grounding and getting them to a place where they feel like, okay, I did 3 things pretty good today, and here's something that I learned. And it's sort of a launching pad for where they want to go the next day.
Is the 3-to-1 ratio, what's that called? Isn't there like some woman that came up with the 3-to-1 ratio?
There probably is. I think I read it in a book. And I want to say it was
Flourish by Martin Seligman?
no. I think it was a book, Chop Wood, Carry Water,
Okay.
which is a great book. That's a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I recommend that you read it. There are a couple of them, and this book is by Justin Metcalf, the one that I'm referring to.
Yeah, I've read that one. That one's actually really good, and I know that I actually remember him bringing that up, and I've heard of Gottman's principle of 5-to-1, who's Julie and John Gottman are the marriage counselors, and they talk about how in a healthy marriage, there's always 5 positive interactions before there's a quote unquote negative interaction.
Yeah.
And so you got that 5-to-1 ratio. And then this book Flourish by Martin Seligman, who's like, the father of positive psychology. He or the founder of positive psychology, he talks about this 3-to-1 ratio in his book a ton. And so I was like, oh my gosh, did you just read that? Maybe you did.
Yeah.
But
I haven't read that, but I would love to. It's just
Flourish is amazing. I took a note on almost every other page.
yeah,
It's really good. But he talks about that, how like you need to be cultivating this sense of gratitude and well-being via the 3-to-1 ratio, which is, like you
yeah.
said, talking about 3 things that went really well that day. And then what was the second thing?
So three things that went really well that day, and one thing that you learned that day.
One thing that you
Um,
learned.
And I love that concept that it's not three things you did well and one thing you didn't do well, but it's really more kind of a positive psychology principle that says, okay, what's something you learned? Like you don't have to label it as like, oh, this didn't go well, or that was a mistake, or that was a failure. Just what did you learn? What is your takeaway, from that day?
Hmm. Yeah, that's huge. I always talk about how there's winners and losers. A lot of people say there's winners and learners, and I'm like, well, like it's okay to be a loser because like winners lose more than losers lose.
Yeah,
And so the only time it's not okay to be a loser though is when you don't learn, because when you don't learn, that's when you're a failure.
yeah,
And so it's okay to be a loser. What it's not okay to be is a failure, and that's when we just like accept losing and don't learn from it and not get better because of it.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
I like that word as well, learn. One thing that I was wondering if we could do, when you take people through this mindfulness exercise, how long does that take normally?
Um, Usually around 5 minutes or so.
5 minutes?
Yeah,
Okay. Could we do a 3-minute one?
sure.
Okay.
Okay.
So if all right, so I'll just let you take over from here. We'll go a 3-minute mindfulness exercise with yeah, pretend I guess I'm one of your clients.
Okay, sounds good. So the first thing I'd have you do would be to get in a comfortable position, um, either sitting in a chair or lying down on the floor with your knees bent is usually the probably the best place to be. And then I would have you close your eyes. And the first thing I would have you do is just begin by taking some nice normal breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. And as you become aware of that, just kind of notice the quality of your breath. And now, as you're breathing, notice the position of your back. Notice how the surface feels against your back, your feet on the floor, and your hands in your lap or on your belly. And as you take a deep breath in, notice how your belly rises, and exhale and notice how your belly falls. And now I invite you to take a deep breath in for a count of 4. So it's inhale through your nose for 1, 2, 3, 4, and exhale through your mouth for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, and exhale, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now just return to a normal breath. And as you do so, imagine a beam of light starting at the top of your head and slowly scanning over your body. And as you do so, notice any places where you feel tension, tightness, tingling sensation, anything out of the ordinary. When you find that place, take a deep breath in and exhale out, and imagine it becoming more calm, relaxed, and open. And then continue down with your light all the way to your toes. And then bring that scan all the way back up to the top of your head. Again, pausing to breathe in and exhale any tension or tightness you may find along the way. And I would close with the last couple of deep breaths in through your nose and exhale out through your mouth. And these last two, imagine breathing in confidence and exhaling any doubt, tension, or tightness that you may be holding on to. Two more times. Inhale, confidence, and exhale, doubt, tension, or tightness. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So that was a basic, a little bit quicker than usual, but a rundown of kind of a mindfulness exercise I might do with somebody.
Yeah, no, that was amazing. So I can definitely see a coach using that before practice with his athletes to kind of get them into the right mindset and ready as a kind of transition routine into them being an athlete. So going from student to athlete. And I think
Yeah.
what you did there was basically like feel where your body is in space, feel your breath.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then it was the
Notice. Tension.
notice the tension and the body scan,
Yep.
and then breathing in confidence and exhaling self-doubt.
Yeah. Good. Good summary.
Dang. So yeah, that was perfect, because that's one of the biggest things I find with coaches is that I talk about meditation, but a lot of them don't even know how to put, or mindfulness activities, but a lot of them don't even know how to go about doing it. So I think that's a
Yeah.
very simple, easy way, like literally just chop out this part of the audio and play it at practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, sometimes I don't know if folks are looking for like a magic pill or a magic technique or something but it's really about just taking a moment to slow down and really ask yourself, okay, where am I today, right? Because that's one thing that I think I've learned over the years is that it doesn't matter if I'm working with an individual who is a first responder or an elite athlete or a stay-at-home mom. Every single person's unique and different, and I think you have to honor that and take the time to allow them to notice what's inside of them, notice what comes up for them, because it's going to be different for everybody,
Hmm.
and so I mean in a team setting, just inviting players, I think, to slow down for a second as they make that transition, especially for student athletes or college student athletes, to make that transition from, the classroom environment or running around or whatever they were doing in their kind of social world into that, okay, here we are. Now we're on the playing field. Now we have to focus our attention on sort of our collective goals and what we're working on together as a team.
Hmm. Yeah, I like what you just said there at the end, focusing on the collective goals.
Mm.
Like, I think reminding them of those collective goals almost on a daily basis
Yeah.
is huge. And I'm actually reading Phil Knight's book. I don't have it in here right now, but 11 Rings. And so he was the Bulls and the Lakers head coach when he
Oh,
won.
Phil Jackson.
Oh, Phil Jackson. Why did I say Phil Knight?
Yeah.
But yeah, Phil Jackson, how he at the beginning of practice would run his guys through like a little mindfulness activity and then
Yeah.
bring them up in a circle and talk about the goals and the things that they wanted to accomplish that day at practice specifically.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about it. I'm like, okay, this guy's won 11 rings. He probably knows what he's doing. And I think back to all of the coaches that I've worked with, and I'm like, I don't know if I even have maybe one that's talked about their goals that they're trying to get done that day at practice with their team.
Wow.
And so now next year, I'm definitely going to go into it and be bringing that up multiple times. Like, hey, like this
Yeah.
is a great time to just remind the guys, hey, today at practice, we're going to be working on box out drills, and we're going to be working on fast breaks, breaking the free throw line as a basketball team. And like, that's literally all you have to say to them to help them
Yeah.
focus on okay, these are the two things that coach wants me to get out of practice today.
Mhm. Why do you think that is? That
That they don't do that.
Yeah, that they don't do that. They tend not to do that.
Well, first of all, thanks for your curiosity. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm
Second of all, I would say that it's probably because they just aren't aware of how important doing that is.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I bet you they aren't even aware of the fact, probably because they have never done it and they never had a
Right.
coach that did it in the past.
Exactly, which I mean, I agree with you. You know, and I think that that goes back to what I was saying before. Like that piece, that awareness piece, is so critical. And you know, I've worked with a few coaches, which I think I'm finding more and more that is a really underserved population. You know, in our business, um, and it's actually kind of a really interesting population because I find that there's a really strong sense of wanting to preserve, you know, a persona that they're presenting out there to their teams. And so I'm not sure if it's the idea that, you know, seeking help or seeking advice or, you know, reaching out is threatening for a lot of folks. I mean, it's threatening for the general population. So, you know, I would imagine for coaches, it's not any different. But I do think that there's certainly a need there, and that's really the starting point. Like, so if you have coaches that are unaware, you know, how do they get their teams to a place where they're actually aware, right? How do they raise that level of awareness in people if they're not willing to look at themselves and say, hey, this is what I'm personally aware of. This is my level of self awareness.
Hmm. Or like or trying something new. Like a lot of guys get caught up and they had a little bit of success and then they're afraid to try anything new and not mess with that level of success, because if they
Yeah,
try anything new, they don't know, are they going to keep going upward or are they going to go down? And I mean, in my experience, the more you try, the more you do, the more it's going to eventually get you in the direction that you're wanting to go, which is higher, so, and more success. But some guys are just comfortable where they're at with the level of success that they're having, and they don't really want to do anything new, or they're afraid, or they have a fixed mindset about those things. I
yeah.
mean, there was one coach that I that I was working at a junior college with the women's basketball team, and the men's baseball coach, he got into a discussion with the women's basketball coach when I wasn't there, and he basically said, like, what are you going to learn from that guy? He's only 23 years old. And I'm like, first of all, I'm 28. Second of all, um, like, that was the most fixed mindset thing I could have ever heard, because I learned stuff from the 9-year-olds that I work with. And
Absolutely.
so, but some people are just like that, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
so it's continuing to help them though. So if you were to like put headphones on every coach in the nation and give them something to help them build their awareness, what
Hmm.
would you tell them?
The first thing I would probably have them do is identify their values. Um, I mean, I use a very like rudimentary worksheet with people that I work with, coaches, athletes, pretty much everybody across the board gets the same worksheet, and it's literally a list of, I think it's 170 words or something like that of values, you know, and I invite them to circle all, you know, their top 10 or whatever it is, top 7, and then number them in order of importance. And then from there, I say, okay, let's grade yourself, you know, um, give yourself a grade from like A, B, C, D, F, like you're in school. And it's really interesting for people to go through and say, you know, okay, how true am I living this value? Well, this one I is an A. You know, that's every day I do that. Every day I'm true to that. You know, but when they start to go through it and they're really honest about it, you see that there are some C's and, you know, maybe even some D's once in a while. And it's like, that's a great conversation to have, that you say it's important to you, and yet you're having a really difficult time living that importance. But that's where I would start, is for, because the coaches have to know, I think, number one, what's important to them. Um, you know, as a coach, what do they want the culture of their team to look like, right? And how truly are they living that first themselves, and what are they doing to facilitate that, like within their group, right? And I think that's a really important starting point. Um, you know, and then kind of working from there and saying, okay, well, how do we make this happen, right?
So within your clients and coaches and the people that you work with, what's one value you see pop up quite a bit?
Um, Probably one of the most common is integrity. You know,
Integrity.
yeah,
Okay, now my
doing.
follow-up question.
Okay, yeah.
Excuse me?
I said doing the right thing when nobody's looking.
Hmm.
That I
Okay, so with that, which I also think what you just did is also vital, is picking the value and then defining the value, what that actually means, because,
Mhm.
the word, like different words mean different things to different people. So having a collective definition will help build clarity around the eventual behaviors that you're going to talk about that exude
Yeah.
integrity. So that was my second question,
Mhm.
was in terms of putting that into practice more, or putting that into the life of the coach and the athlete and the culture of the team more, what is one way that you can build integrity into the team or into the person?
Yeah. I think conversations about like, off court behavior, off field behavior, what does that look like for you? What does it look like when you're on the field? I think it's a little easier to behave with integrity to a certain extent when you're on the field, right? Because there's a level of obvious accountability, and that's not, people may not constantly be looking at you per se to say, hey, are you really giving your best effort? But there's a level of visual accountability, right? Like, your teammates know if you're slacking or not.
Oh
But
my gosh, yes.
right?
That's so true.
But then the other piece is, okay, what are you doing when you're not here? Are you partying? Are you up all night on Xbox? Are you just not taking care of yourself? That becomes another level of that.
Hmm. Yeah, that made me think of back when I was playing baseball at Indiana State. Our catcher, we were doing a base running drill, and one of our outfielders, Tony Roselli, he was going from second to third on a bunt, and the catcher yelled at him and goes like, "Hey, Tony, we need you to go 100%." Right?
Mhm.
And Tony defends himself and goes, "I was going 100%."
Mhm.
Okay, even if he was going 100%,
Mhm.
and a teammate says, "Hey, I need more from you,"
Yeah.
I feel like you have to dig down and give more.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not necessarily I was or I wasn't. It's okay, like I could push myself just a little bit harder, you
Yeah.
know? And so that's where the visual accountability, that's what I thought of when I heard you say that, because
Mhm.
it is so true. Like there is that. And then when you do get held accountable, it's, are you responding productively, or are you responding unproductively with that, like blaming, complaining, defending sort of mindset and actions and words?
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's a great point. So that's like another piece, right? Like, how are you personally responding to those challenges? When somebody challenges you, what's that internal dialogue look like? What is that, um, and I think a lot of times I found that athletes don't necessarily recognize that internal dialogue. So, are you familiar with the inner game of tennis? Like,
yes.
yeah. So that's a great book, and one of the things that he talks about, which I absolutely love, is this concept of kind of self one and self two. And you know like I've found this really helpful actually with tennis players. But he basically describes, and I always switch these two, so just bear with me, but I think of self one, um, as sort of the intuitive self, and like I said, Callaway, he describes it differently, but so if self one is sort of the intuitive self, the self that just kind of observes and notices and makes adjustments, and it's sort of that self we all start out with when we're first learning to walk, right? We're babies, we start crawling, and eventually pull up on something, and we start taking a step forward, and then fall down. The baby's not saying to itself like, gosh, I really stink at this walking thing, like, that's it, I give up. They get up again, and they're making adjustments, and they're just kind of you know eventually getting to a place where, oh, okay, I feel this, I'm moving. And that's why I think babies grow and develop so fast, in such a short period of time. There is no internal dialogue that's offering any kind of critique or criticism or judgment or anything like that. So if you think of that as sort of self too, that we all sort of develop as we, kind of get a little bit older, become adults, or actually go to school and start comparing ourselves to others and so on, and so if you think of those two roles of self one and self two, that self two becomes very loud, I think, for athletes, and if it's not kept in check, it can kind of take over and become that, the loudest voice in the room, if you will, or the loudest voice on the field or on the court or wherever it is. So much so that when you get feedback from your teammates or your coaches, all of a sudden you're not able to hear it for the purity that's in there, right? Like a mom might say to a baby, okay, one step, walk toward mommy or whatever it is. And the baby kind of can make adjustments and is motivated to do that. But when now we have sort of this internal voice that is much more of a critic and much more of a judge, it's much harder. Our initial response is to defend ourselves, like your catcher. He wanted to defend himself. That was his first go-to.
Mm-hmm.
And while that may still kind of motivate him to do better, I would wonder what the other part of that internal dialogue looks like. Is he saying, "Oh, that guy's a jerk"? Who's he to tell me? Those kind of things, as opposed to just taking it for the pure observation that it is. Hey, maybe I'm not pushing myself. Let me see what's out there. Let me try.
So my question to you now is, okay, how do we teach our athletes about self-one and self-two, and how do we get them to be more of a self-one type of athlete instead of a self-two judgmental athlete?
Yeah. So the first piece is that awareness piece, and talking about, okay, what is the role of self-one? What is the role of self-two? And then looking at, what have I learned? Like, what is my skill set? Like, working with a tennis player, for example, we worked on this quite a lot. Like, first of all, these are the skills, you know how to serve, you know how to return, you know how to move. All of these things are already wired within you, right? You've already learned that through hours and hours and hours of practice. And it's about learning to trust your body, right? And then learning how to first notice the actual internal dialogue. Okay, so what happens when you hit the ball into the net? I say, well, that was awful. Okay, there's self-two, right? Now we're starting to notice self-two's role. And
So
so
just real quick, what would self-one say in that case if you hit it into the net?
self-one says, the only thing self-one says is, okay, I need to hit it this way to get it over the net. It's
Okay.
maybe it's totally process cues, right? It's totally just, okay, adjust the mechanics. Okay, adjust that, making those physiological adjustments.
Mm, gotcha. And what it sounds like is either during practice, you have maybe a coach there saying like, okay, what happened right there? What were you thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Or what were you feeling? Or what was the image you had in your head right there? Or after practice, the athlete can have like a post-practice journal, or maybe it's even a post-practice audio recorder that they
Yeah.
just speak to their phone, and therefore they're speaking to themselves out loud that they could listen to maybe the next day before practice to remind themselves of.
Yeah.
They ask themselves certain questions like, what happened? What was I thinking to myself today? What was the one thing I thought when I hit the ball into the net today?
Yeah.
Or what's the one thing I thought when I hit it out of bounds on my second serve today?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of like the post-practice journaling. I think, number one, if you can get the coach on board and give them a little bit of that language to say, okay, hey, what'd you notice? What did you just notice there? What's that internal dialogue sound like? I think that's a huge piece. If
Mm-hmm.
you can't get even if you're not, I've worked with athletes that coaches, their position is, what, I do this sports psychology stuff. You don't need an outside person. And in those circumstances, and if the athlete still wants to work with me, we continue to work together. But that's when it's really important for them to do their own journaling and their own homework, and to ask themselves, hey, so out of 10 serves, I hit 5 of them into the net. What did I notice about that? What was I saying to myself? What is that internal dialogue like? I also will use like visualization to help them kind of get back to that place. Say, okay, replay that in your head. really see it, really experience it, feel it. What was that like? What'd you say to yourself? You know, to help them get back there.
That's a really good add-on to some of the questions that I've asked them in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So to, hey, put yourself back in this moment. So you're setting them up cognitively to basically come up with the best answer possible
Yeah.
instead of just writing down what they think. Now it's like, okay, it's a deeper level of thinking that they're
Yeah.
getting into with that question. I like that. With post-practice journaling or post-scrimmage or post-game journaling, this year specifically, I've had a lot of athletes come to me and say that they're anxious or they're nervous or they're upset or they're like some sort of feeling or emotion is taking over them
Mm-hmm.
after they get done playing. And what I've noticed is that they don't have an objective way to look at their performance. So therefore, they're basing it completely off of how they feel.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've basically implemented post-practice journaling to help them with being process driven instead of emotion driven.
Mm-hmm.
Like even they could go out there and statistically do great and they still feel like they did bad, but then as soon as we go back and look at it in a systematic way, they're like, oh, okay, like I actually didn't do as bad as I thought. Or the other way around, they could feel they did great, and they're riding their high horse and they come in and they're like, okay, like I did this and this really well. This is the one thing I can now improve on, going
Mm-hmm.
back to that 3-to-1 principle.
Yeah.
So one of the post-practice journals that I've come up with for them is list of 3 wins. So they list 3 wins from that day at practice and or the scrimmage or their game. And then I
Mm-hmm.
have them rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 for 4 different questions. Now this is for a softball pitcher, for instance, but like the 4 questions would be like, was I competitive? A scale of 1 to 7. Did I attack the game? 1 through 7. How did I do going one pitch at a time or just going, step by step process, sticking to my plan? And then did I hit my spots? Scale of 1 to 7. So now she's looking at it a little bit more objectively, even though those are subjective measures,
Uh-huh.
there are also, it's like an objective way of looking at it. So after
Yeah.
she gets done with that, now it's like, oh, okay, like looking at this, I can look at it more from that learning mindset that we were
Mm-hmm.
talking about, instead of just kind of like, I suck, or I'm great, and
Mm-hmm.
getting away from those highs and lows and just becoming more consistent overall.
Yeah, I love that. And then they also have an opportunity to go back and look at, their progress along the way on
Hmm.
these points.
So when one thing that I'm kind of thinking about is coaches have a hard time with, oh, I don't have the time to do this, I don't have the time to do that.
Yeah.
So the meditation or the mindfulness activity that we went through earlier on this call, that was
Yeah.
like 3 minutes. So do you have 3 minutes at the beginning of practice? I think it was like Buddha or somebody said, I forget exactly who it was, but he said, if you don't have 5 minutes to meditate, then you're too busy.
Yeah.
And then at the end of practice, like this could be a 1 minute activity where you just ask your team, hey, what's one thing you learned at practice today? Or think back to today when you failed at practice
Mm-hmm.
in one of the activities. What was your self-talk like? And then, hey, now pair up with your partner and share it with your partner.
Right.
And then now you're working on that self 1 and self 2 and becoming more aware of it. And literally, I could see that taking 30 to 60 seconds. Maybe think to yourself for 15 seconds and then talk to your partner for 30 seconds. And then you have one person share.
Mhm.
And there you go. You have a 1 minute and 30-second activity that just helped you win another game potentially because you're getting your athletes to think positively or productively
Yeah.
more
And
often.
you're also doing another thing there too, and encouraging their communication with one another. That's something that I think is so vital. And such one of the beautiful things that's still preserved in sports, because most of the time you're not allowed to have your cell phone or any kind of device on the field, right, or on the court or whatever. And so that's I think that's a great way to encourage that communication and interaction, and you're ultimately team building in those moments. Another end of practice exercise that I've really enjoyed, and I've put into practice myself with teams, and I've seen other teams use this, and I love it, is where the athletes themselves, they're kind of in a circle and they identify. And again, this only takes a minute or two. You're in a huddle and you ask maybe 3, 4, 5 players to say, tell me something that you observed one of your teammates doing well today. I think that's a really powerful exercise.
Yeah, I love that one. That is definitely a good one because, well, what's your reasoning behind like why it's such a great activity?
Yeah. Well, again, because number one, it fosters that communication. It invites people to step outside their comfort zone. So a lot of times I think, unless you ask for those volunteers, people don't walk up to their teammate and say, "Hey, you know what? I thought you really hustled on defense today. You did a great job." They're just not going to say that.
True.
So when you invite them to think about it and ask for volunteers, put the expectation out there that, yeah, I expect you to participate in this. There's that piece of it. The second piece is you're saying something positive about your teammates, and you're ultimately really cultivating sort of that team chemistry, and you're inviting kind of team building and team growth in that and literally it takes like a minute or two, to have
Hmm.
3, 4, or 5 people participate. Not every single person has to do it every time. And maybe once in a while the coach chimes in and offers something.
Hmm. And I think actually the coach, when he first or she first brings it up, they definitely need to lead the way there and
For
show
sure.
them how it's done.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, that activity is key. When you were, I kind of want to talk about you being a black belt in mixed martial arts and Tae Kwon Do. So, because that's a individual sport,
Hmm.
right? But you do it in a class, in a group class setting,
Yeah. Hmm.
right? So, what's like one strategy that was this like recently, or are you currently still practicing, or?
Yeah, I wish I was. I tore my ACL back in 2014.
Mm,
And then I went back a year later to Taekwondo. And I tore it in Taekwondo, but totally like a lot of ACL injuries, non-contact. It was just in practice. I was doing a tornado kick, which sounds fancy, but it's pretty basic. And I had done it thousands of times before. And just when I landed, I injured myself. So then a year later, I went back to it and I was trying to kind of get back, and I was training for my second degree. And I injured myself again and tore my meniscus. And so it hasn't ever quite been right. And I have a very aggressive performance trainer right now that his goal is to help me to get back to, just to taking classes, doing forms and those kind of things. I would love to be able to do that again.
mm,
So yeah, but it's been quite a few years since I've competed. And I didn't compete in mixed martial arts. I did go through the entire curriculum from start to finish to complete my black belt. Um, but I only competed in Taekwondo.
mm-hmm.
I did more demonstration stuff with mixed martial arts.
So one of my questions is, what what did you use the most in terms of mental performance? What did you do that helped you the most? That was like a mental performance strategy or technique that you had learned in your schooling that you use the most in martial arts or taekwondo?
Yeah. Gosh, probably what I use the most is that awareness piece, and then focus, like the concept of focus and the concept of like paying attention to one thing. My taekwondo instructor, he's from Korea, and he was amazing. I mean, he taught me so much really about the mental side of sports, and I'm not even sure that he recognized that he was teaching me at the time. But it was just kind of so natural and part of what we were doing. But he used to tell me when I was working on forms, and I couldn't get it, and I was just struggling to kind of get the form that he was teaching, he would say, you're trying to catch too many bunnies at one time. He said, focus on catching one bunny at a time. So for him, he meant, focus on the movement, or focus on the timing, or focus on snapping, whatever piece of that was, as opposed to me trying to focus on, the movement of the form and the timing and the strength and the power that I was using. And so
That is so cool that he brought that up, because that's what I found in elite coaches that I've worked with, is that they get their athletes to focus on just one thing. And I think the old saying that he was getting at is chase two rabbits, catch none.
right.
And so because I talk about that all the time.
Yeah.
And I used to say, like, simplify down your game into just three things. But
Right.
even that was too complicated. Like, your brain can't think about three things at once while you're trying to perform at your best. What it's really doing is it's focusing on just one thing. So for him to say that, hey, you're trying to catch too many bunnies at one time, simplify your process, simplify what you're thinking about. And then I'm sure as soon as all you were thinking about was that one thing of you just focusing on your power, or you just focusing on your follow through, or you just focusing on your balance. As soon as you did that, it was like everything snapped into place.
Well, yeah. And I mean, yes and no, because there was a systematic approach to it too, right? Like there was a way to learn those forms. There was a way to learn every, and I think that's one of the things that I really love about martial arts, is that, you don't just start throwing roundhouse kicks. Like, that's not, you don't just walk into class and, okay, here you go, throw a roundhouse kick, and that's great. Now break a board. That's not class one. Like, there's a whole process to it. And if you skip over the steps in that process, you're going to miss something, and you're going to either hurt yourself, or you're not going to learn the skill. So, and I think that's probably the other piece that I learned through martial arts, both mixed martial arts and Tae Kwon Do, is the importance of paying attention to the process. We talk about it a lot, and we talk about, being process oriented, but that sport illustrates it to the nth degree, because, like I said, if you start skipping pieces of that process, you're going to hurt yourself, or somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, trusting the process, paying attention to the process, executing the process. I mean, it's all critical. And a lot of people say now, hey, trust the process, trust the process, trust the process. And the one thing that I like that you just brought up is that, like, martial arts, mixed martial arts, and Tae Kwon Do have a process that they go through, and then it's up to you to stick with it and execute that process. A lot of people don't even have a process, and they're talking about trusting the process. Right. And I'm like, they're like, trust the process, trust the process. I'm like, okay, tell me about your process. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, you're the one who just said you're trusting the process. I want you to describe your process to me. Right. And then when they can't, that's when kind of the door opens into that awareness that we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's really cool. So basically, like, to recap that, he was talking about just trusting the process and executing what you were executing in that moment, instead of trying to do like three different things at one time, or whatever it might be. So one of the things you brought up earlier was accountability with, we were talking about that visual accountability on the field. How do you get somebody to hold themselves more accountable?
That's such a great question. It's like the $1 million question, right? And I think that's where the importance of, like, having them illustrate their values with you. That's an ongoing conversation, right? So, okay, you just told, excuse me, you just told me that, this particular thing was important, and this is something that, that you hold as important. And yet, when you're not living that, right? You're off the field, and you're doing things that really don't line up with that value that you just told me is really important to you. I think having a realistic and honest conversation about that with people is really important, because at the end of the day, I'm not the one that makes those choices. So I do a lot of talking about responsibility of choice, and knowing that there are things that we can control and things we can't control. So that conversation about, controlling the controllables, um, I find that really especially powerful with adolescent athletes, teen athletes, young adult athletes, because I think they get to this place where they're involved in high level sports, and they feel like, well, between that and school and parents and all these other demands, I don't have control over anything in my life, right? And so illustrating for them what they do have control over, that every single day they have a choice, they have the power to make a choice about what attitude they're going to deploy that day, what their effort is going to look like. That's all in their control. So identifying what's important to them. If you're telling me that this is important, okay, what's your attitude that toward living that, right? Toward living that truth. You told me that honesty is important, right? You lied to your coach that you were home by curfew or whatever it was. Is that really true for you? Because if it's not, that's okay. But decide what's true for you, and then live it. And so I think it goes back to that, like, just teaching people that they have so much power in their choices, and that's 100% on them. That's 100% their responsibility.
So do you believe, just off of that last part, do you believe that everything happens for a reason, or there's a reason that everything happens?
um that's an interesting way to phrase that question. I think what I believe is that there's something to be learned from everything. And so I don't know if I would say everything happens for a reason, but I think that there's an opportunity in everything that happens. An
Mm,
opportunity to learn, an opportunity to grow. um and so, yeah, I guess I would lean more toward everything happens for a reason. um but I don't know if I would necessarily define it that way.
hmm. That's a interesting question to me because of the
Yeah.
control what you can control philosophy.
Yeah.
Like when I'm talking to an athlete about that and they're talking about how, like, oh, I can control this, I can control that. And then they'll say something like something doesn't go their way. And they'll be like, oh, everything happens for a reason. Or, they lose and they're like, well, everything happens for a reason. And I'm like, or is it there's a reason that everything happened? Like when you say there's a reason that everything happened, like then I think that puts more control into your hands
Yeah.
because when everything happens for a reason, it's almost like I can do whatever I want and
Yeah.
whatever's going to happen is going to happen, instead of being
Yeah.
like, no, like here's the reason, if I do this, I'm giving myself a better shot at getting what I want. So
Yeah.
then it comes back to doing what you have to do to get what you want
Yeah.
and executing the process. If you execute the process, then you will eventually get what you want if you stick with it.
Yeah. No, I like what you said. And I do think that, I think that both can probably be true, um, at the same time, because there are going to be things
Good
that
point.
happen, that I mean, are circumstances that are completely outside of our control. Someone in our family, gets sick, gets really sick. Is there anything you could have done to control that? Probably not. Probably not. However, you do have now an opportunity to decide how you're going to approach that, right? Mentally, physically, in your actions, in how you address that person, whatever it is, right? But to your point, I love what you said. And when you're talking about sports, I love that mindset and that approach, in terms of sports, because you're right. Yeah, it does go back to that. Like, okay, well, what could I have done differently, right? And if you're not asking yourself that, then you're not learning.
Mm. And what you just said made me think even deeper into the question. And now I'm like, regardless of the reason, like it did happen. So now what are you going to do about it moving forward? Which
Yeah,
coincides with what you just said as well.
yeah.
Oh man, yeah, I love that question. I think
That's a
it's
great. Yeah, that's a great question.
um, so cool. Well, I know we're getting close to the hour mark. I like to keep these at an hour or a little bit under. That way I'm not taking up too much of the people's time that I love, which reminds me, if you're listening right now, go ahead and go into the iTunes app and rate the podcast, please. You can give it whatever rating you want. I don't care if it's a 1-star or a 5-star, but getting ratings in there is going to be amazing. And then, so thanks for that if you go in there and do it. Anyways, so I'd say we wrap this up. How I like to end these calls is ask one more question, which is, what is your number one takeaway from this call? Or what's the one thing that we talked about that you think is the most important?
I actually love what you just said, and I think that that's a great thing to share with athletes. So I thank you for that. I learned a little bit of different perspective to take on, do things happen for a reason, or is there a reason that things happen? That's a great question to ask clients, to ask teammates, to ask players and coaches and, other folks I work with. So
Dang, thank you.
that's my takeaway.
I think, yeah, it's huge. Like, control what you can control. It always gets back to that, like, rule number one of life. And then I think my number one takeaway from this talk that we had is awareness and building awareness into every day at practice, because if what you aren't aware of controls you, whereas what you are aware of you can control.
Yeah.
And
Awesome.
so I love that little piece, is that I feel like this whole talk was basically building awareness in your athletes and in yourself as well.
Right.
So awesome, Gina. Well, thank you for being on. I appreciate it. And we will talk soon.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Todd. See you.
No problem.
All right.